Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to yet another B9400 podcast episode on figures of the American Civil War. Today I will be discussing the life, service, and impact of Union General Ambrose Burnside. Ambrose Everett Burnside, born May 23, 1824, in Liberty, Indiana, was an American Army officer and politician who became a senior Union general in the Civil War and free-time governor of Rhode Island, as well as being a successful inventor and industrialist. He was responsible for some of the earliest victories in the Eastern Theater, but was then promoted above his abilities and is mainly remembered for two disastrous defeats at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and the Battle of the Crater, Petersburg, Virginia. Although an inquiry cleared him of blame in the later claim, he never regained credibility as an army commander. Burnside was a modest and unassuming individual, mindful of his limitations, who had been propelled to high command against his will. He could have been described as a genuinely unlucky man, both in battle and in business, where he was robbed of the rights to a successful cavalry firearm that had been his own invention. His spectacular growth of whiskers became known as sideburns, deriving from the two parts of his surname. Early life. Burnside was born in Liberty, Indiana, and was the fourth of 9 children of Edgehill and Pamela Brown Burnside, a family of English and Irish origins. His great-grandfather, Robert Burnside, born 1725, died 1775, was born in Scotland and settled in the province of South Carolina. His father was a native of South Carolina. He was a slave owner who freed his slaves when he relocated to Indiana in the Midwest. Ambrose attended Liberty Seminary as a young boy, but his education was interrupted when his mother died in 1841. He was apprenticed to a local tailor, eventually becoming a partner in the business. As a young officer, just before the Civil War, Burnside was engaged to Charlotte Lottie Moon, who left him at the altar. When the minister asked if she took him as her husband, Moon is said to have shouted, "No, sirree, Bob," before running out of the church. Moon is best known for her espionage for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Later, Burnside arrested Moon, her younger sister Virginia, nicknamed Ginny Moon, and their mother. He kept them under house arrest for months, but never charged them with espionage officially. Early military career. He obtained an appointment to the United States Military Academy located in West Point, upstate New York in 1843 through his father's political connections and his own interest in military affairs. He graduated in 1847, ranking 18th in a class of 47, and was commissioned a brevet second lieutenant in the 2nd United States Artillery. He traveled to Veracruz for the Mexican-American War, but he arrived after hostilities had ceased and performed mostly garrison duty around Mexico City. At the close of the war, Lieutenant Burnside served 2 years on the western frontier under Captain Braxton Bragg in the 3rd Artillery, a light artillery unit that had been converted to cavalry duty, protecting the western mail routes through Nevada to California. In August 1849, he was wounded by an arrow in his neck during a skirmish against Apaches in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He was promoted to first lieutenant on December 12, 1851. In 1852, he was assigned to Fort Adams, Newport, Rhode Island, and he married Mary Richmond Bishop of Providence, Rhode Island, on April 27th of that year. The marriage lasted until Mary's death in 1876, but was childless. In October 1853, Burnside resigned his commission in the United States Army and was appointed commander of the Rhode Island State Militia with the rank of Major General. He held this position for 2 years. After leaving the regular army, Burnside devoted his time and energy to the manufacture of a firearm that bears his name, the Burnside carbine. President Buchanan's Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, contracted the Burnside Arms Company to equip a large portion of the army with his carbine, mostly cavalry, and induced him to establish extensive factories for its manufacture. The Bristol Rifle Works were no sooner complete than another gunmaker allegedly bribed Floyd to break his $100,000 contract with Burnside. Burnside ran as a Democrat for one of the congressional seats in Rhode Island in 1858 and was defeated in a landslide. The burdens of the campaigns and the destruction by fire of his factory contributed to his financial ruin and was forced to assign his firearm patents to others. He then went west in search of employment and became treasurer of the Illinois Central Railroad, where he worked for and became friendly with George B. McClellan, who later became one of his commanding officers. Burnside became familiar with corporate attorney Abraham Lincoln, future President of the United States, during this period. Civil War and the Battle of the First Bull Run in Virginia. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Burnside was colonel in the Rhode Island militia. He raised the 1st Rhode Island Volunteer Infantry Regiment and was appointed its colonel on the 2nd of May, 1861. 2 companies of this regiment were then armed with Burnside carbines. Within a month, he ascended to brigade command in the Department of Northeast Virginia. He commanded the brigade without distinction at the First Battle of the Bull Run in July and took over division command temporarily for wounded Brigadier General David Hunter. His 90-day regiment was mustered out of service on August 2nd. He was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers on August 6th and was assigned to train provincial brigades in the Army of the Potomac. North Carolina. Burnside commanded the Coast Division, or North Carolina Expeditionary Force, from September 1861 until July 1862. 3 brigades assembled in Annapolis, Maryland, which formed the nucleus for his future corps. He conducted a successful amphibious campaign that closed more than 80% of the North Carolina seacoast to Confederate shipping for the remainder of the war. This included the Battle of Elizabeth City, fought on February 10, 1862, on the Pasquotank River near Elizabeth City, North Carolina. The participants were vessels of the United States Navy North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, opposed by vessels of the Confederate Navy's Mosquito Fleet. The latter was supported by a shore-based battery of 4 guns at Cobb's Point, now called Cobb Point, near the southeastern border of the town. The battle was part of the campaign in North Carolina that was led by Burnside and known as the Burnside Expedition. The result was a Union victory, with Elizabeth City and its nearby waters in their possession and the Confederate fleet captured, sunk, or dispersed. Burnside was promoted to Major General of Volunteers on the 18th of March, 1862, in recognition of his successes at the battles of Roanoke Island and New Bern, Virginia, the first significant Union victories in the Eastern Theater. In July, his forces were transported north to Newport News, Virginia, and became the Free Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Burnside was offered command of the Army of the Potomac following Major General George B. McClellan's failure in the Peninsula Campaign. He refused this opportunity because of his loyalty to McClellan and the fact that he understood his own lack of military experience and detached part of his corps in support of Major General John Pope's Army of Virginia in the Northern Virginia Campaign. He received telegrams at this time from Major General John Porter, who were extremely critical of Pope's abilities as a commander, and he forwarded it on to his superiors in concurrence. This episode later played a significant role in Porter's court-martial, in which Burnside appeared as a witness. Burnside again declined command following Pope's debacle at the Battle of the Second Bull Run, Virginia. Antietam. Burnside was given command of the right wing of the Army of the Potomac, the First Corps and his own Free Corps at the start of the Maryland campaign for the Battle of South Mountain, but McClellan separated the 2 corps at the Battle of Antietam, placing them on opposite ends of the Union battle line and returning Burnside to command of just the Free Corps. Burnside implicitly refused to give up his authority and acted as though the corps commander was first Major General Jesse L. Reno, killed at South Mountain, and then Brigadier General Jacob D. Cox, funneling orders through them to the corps. The cumbersome arrangement contributed to his slowness in attacking and crossing what is now called Burnside's Bridge on the southern flank of the Union line. Burnside did not perform an adequate reconnaissance of the area, and he did not take advantage of several easy forwarding sites out of range of the enemy. His troops were forced into repeated assaults across the narrow bridge, which was dominated by Confederate sharpshooters, on the high ground. By noon, McClellan was losing patience. He sent a succession of couriers to motivate Burnside to move forward, ordering one aide to Tell him if it costs 10,000 men, he must go now. He further increased the pressure by sending his inspector general to confront Burnside, who reacted indignantly. McClellan appears to think, I am not trying my best to carry this bridge. You are the third or fourth one who has been to me this morning with similar orders. The Free Corps eventually broke through, but the delay allowed Major General A.P. Hill's Confederate division to come up from Harper's Ferry and repulse the Union breakthrough. McClellan refused Burnside's request for reinforcements, and the battle ended in a tactical stalemate. Fredericksburg, Virginia. After McClellan failed to pursue General Robert E. Lee's retreat from Antietam, Lincoln ordered McClellan's removal on November 5, 1862, and selected Burnside to replace him on November 7, 1862. Burnside reluctantly obeyed this order to the third such in his brief career, in part because the courier told him that if he refused, the command would instead go to Major General Joseph Hooker, whom Burnside disliked. Burnside assumed charge of the Army of the Potomac in a change of command ceremony at the farm of Julia Claggett in New Baltimore, Virginia. McClellan visited troops to bid them farewell. Columbia Claggett, Julia Cleggett's daughter-in-law, testified after the war that a parade and transfer of the army to General Burnside took place on our farm in front of our house in a change of command ceremony at New Baltimore, Virginia on the 9th of November, 1862. President Abraham Lincoln pressured Burnside to take aggressive action and approved his plan on November 14th to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. This plan led to a humiliating and costly Union defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13th. His advance upon Fredericksburg was rapid, but the attack was delayed when the engineers were slow to marshal pontoon bridges for crossing the Rappahannock River, as well as his own reluctance to deploy portions of his army across fording points. This allowed General Lee to concentrate along Mayor's Heights, just west of town, and easily repulse the Union attacks. Assaults south of the town were mismanaged, which was supposed to be the main avenue attack, and initial Union breakthroughs went unsupported. Burnside was upset by the failure of his plan and by the enormous casualties of his repeated futile frontal assaults, and declared that he would personally lead an assault by the Free Corps. His corps commanders talked him out of it, but relations were strained between the general and his subordinates. Accepting full blame, he offered to retire from the United States Army, but this was refused. Burnside's detractors labeled him as the Butcher of Fredericksburg. In January of 1863, Burnside launched a second offensive against Lee, but it bogged down in winter rains before anything was accomplished, and has derisively been called the Mud March. In its wake, he asked that several openly insubordinate officers be relieved of duty and court-martialed. He also offered to resign. Lincoln quickly accepted the latter option, and on January 26 replaced Burnside with Major General Joseph Hooker, one of the officers who had conspired against him. East Tennessee. Burnside offered to resign his commission altogether, but Lincoln declined, stating that there still could be a place for him in the army. Thus, he was placed back at the head of the Free Corps and sent to command the Department of Ohio, encompassing the states of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois. This was a quiet area with little activity, and the president reasoned that Burnside could not get himself into too much trouble there. However, anti-war sentiment was riding high in the western states, as they had traditionally carried on a great deal of commerce with the South, and there was little in the way of abolitionist sentiment there or desire to fight for the purpose of ending slavery. Burnside was thoroughly disturbed by this trend and issued a series of orders forbidding the expression of public sentiments against the war or the administration in his department. This finally climaxed to General Order No. 38, which declared that any person found guilty of treason will be tried by a military tribunal and either imprisoned or banished to enemy lines. On the 1st of May 1863, Ohio Congressman Clement A. Vallandigham, a prominent opponent of the war, held a large public rally in Mount Vernon, Ohio, in which he denounced President Lincoln as a tyrant who sought to abolish the Constitution and set up a dictatorship. Burnside had dispatched several agents to the rally who took down notes and brought back their evidence to the general, who then declared that it was significant grounds to arrest Vallandigham for treason. A military court tried him and found him guilty of violating General Order No. 38. Despite his protests that he was simply expressing his opinions in public, Vallandigham was sentenced to imprisonment for the duration of the war and was turned into a martyr by anti-war Democrats. Burnside next turned his attention to Illinois, where the Chicago Times newspaper had been printing anti-war editorials for months. The General dispatched a squadron of troops to the paper's offices and ordered them to cease printing. Lincoln had not been asked or informed about either Vallandigham's arrest or the closure of the Chicago Times. He remembered the section of General Order No. 38, which declared that officers would be banished to enemy lines, and finally decided that it was a good idea, so Vallandigham was freed from jail and sent to Confederate hands. Meanwhile, Lincoln ordered the Chicago Times to be reopened and announced that Burnside had exceeded his authority in both cases. The president then issued a warning that generals were not to arrest civilians or close down newspapers again without the White House's official permission. Burnside also dealt with Confederate raiders such as John Hunt Morgan. In the Knoxville, Tennessee campaign, Burnside advanced to Knoxville first by bypassing the Confederate-held Cumberland Gap and ultimately occupying Knoxville unopposed. He then sent troops back to the Cumberland Gap. Confederate Commander Brigadier General John W. Fraser refused to surrender in the face of two Union brigades, but Burnside arrived with a third, forcing the surrender of Fraser and 2,300 Confederate soldiers. Union Major General William S. Rosecrans was defeated at the Battle of Chickamauga, Tennessee, and Burnside was pursued by Lieutenant General James Longstreet, against whose troops he had battled at Mares Heights. Burnside skillfully outmaneuvered Longstreet at the Battle of Campbell Station and was able to reach his entrenchments and safety in Knoxville, where he was briefly besieged until the Confederate defeat at the Battle of Fort Sanders outside the city. Tying down Longstreet's corps at Knoxville contributed to General Braxton Bragg's defeat by Major General Ulysses S. Grant at Chattanooga. Troops under Major General William T. Sherman marched to Burnside's aid, but the siege had already been lifted. Longstreet withdrew, eventually returning to Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Overland Campaign. Burnside was ordered to take the Free Corps back to the Eastern Theater, where he built it up to a strength of over 21,000 in Annapolis, Maryland. The Free Corps fought in the Overland Campaign of May 1864 as an independent command, reporting initially to General Grant. His corps was not assigned to the Army of the Potomac because Burnside outranked its commander, Major General George G. Meade, who had been a division commander under Burnside at Fredericksburg. The cumbersome arrangement was rectified on May 24th, just before the Battle of North Anna, when Burnside agreed to waive his precedence of rank and was placed under Meade's direct command. Burnside fought at the battles of Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse, where he did not perform in a distinguished manner, attacking piecemeal and ordering reluctant to commit his troops to the frontal assaults that characterized these battles. After North Anna and Cold Harbor, he took his place in the siege lines at Petersburg, Virginia. The Crater. The Petersburg Crater, Virginia, 1865. As the two armies faced the stalemate of trench warfare at Petersburg in July 1864, Burnside agreed to a plan suggested by a regiment of former coal miners in his corps, the 48th Pennsylvania, to dig a mine under a fort named Elliott's Salient in the Confederate entrenchments and ignite explosives there to achieve a surprise breakthrough. The fort was destroyed on July 30th in what is known as the Battle of the Crater, Virginia. Because of interference from Meade, Burnside was ordered only hours before the infantry attack not to use his division of black troops, which had been specifically trained for the assault. Instead, he was forced to use untrained white troops. He could not decide which division to choose as a replacement, so he had his three subordinate commanders draw lots. The division chosen by chance was that commanded by Brigadier General James H. Ledeel, who failed to brief the men on what was expected of them and was reported during the battle to be getting drunk in a bomb-proof shelter well behind the lines. Proving no leadership, Ledley's men entered the huge crater instead of going around it, became trapped, and were subject to heavy fire from Confederates around the rim, resulting in high casualties. Burnside was relieved of command on August 14th and sent on extended leave by Grant. He was never recalled to duty for the remainder of the war. A court of inquiry later placed the blame for the crater fiasco on Burnside and his subordinates. In December, Burnside met with President Lincoln and General Grant about his future. He was contemplating resignation, but President Lincoln and General Grant requested that he remain in the Army. At the end of the interview, Burnside wrote, "I was not informed of any duty upon which I am to be placed." He finally resigned his commission on the 15th of April, 1865, after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The United States Congress Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War later exonerated General Burnside and placed the blame for the Union defeat at the Crater on General Meade for requiring the specially trained USCT, United States Colored Troops, men to be withdrawn. Postbellum career. After his resignation, Burnside was employed in numerous railroad and industrial directorships, including the presidencies of the Cincinnati and Martinsville Railroad, the Indianapolis and Vincennes Railroad, the Cairo and Vincennes Railroad, and the Rhode Island Locomotive Works. He was elected to free one-year terms as governor of Rhode Island, serving from the 29th of May, 1866 to the 25th of May, 1869. He was nominated by the Republican Party to be their candidate for governor in March 1866, and Burnside was elected governor in a landslide on the 4th of April, 1866. Then began Burnside's political career as a Republican, as he had been a Democrat before the war. Burnside was a companion of the Massachusetts Commandery of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, a military society of Union officers and their descendants, and served as the junior vice commander of the Massachusetts Commandery in 1869. He was commander-in-chief of the Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Association from 1871 to 1872, and also served as the commander of the Department of Rhode Island, otherwise known as GAR. At its inception in 1871, the National Rifle Association, otherwise known as the NRA, chose him as its first president. During a visit to Europe in 1870, Burnside attempted to mediate between the French and Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. He was first registered at the offices of Drexel, Harjes & Co., Geneva. Week ending November 5, 1870, Drexel Harjes was a major lender to the new French government after the war, helping it to repay its massive war reparations. In 1876, Burnside was elected commander of the New England Battalion of the Centennial Legion, the title of a collection of 13 militia units from the original 13 states, which participated in the parade in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on the 4th of July, 1876, to mark the centennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In 1874, Burnside was elected by the Rhode Island Senate as a United States Senator from Rhode Island, was re-elected in 1880, and served until his death in 1881. Burnside continued his association with the Republican Party, playing a prominent role in military affairs, as well as serving as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in 1881. Death and burial. Burnside died suddenly of neuralgia, I probably butchered that, of the heart, and angina pectorosis, I probably butchered that again, on the morning of September 13, 1881, at his home in Bristol, Rhode Island, accompanied only by his doctor and family servants. A procession took his casket in a hearse drawn by 4 black horses to the First Congregational Church for services, which were attended by many local dignitaries. Following the services, the procession made its way to Swan Point Cemetery for burial. Businesses and mills were closed for much of the day, and thousands of mourners from all towns of the state and many places in Massachusetts and Connecticut crowded the streets of Providence for the occasion. That just about concludes another B9400 podcast episode for today. I hope you enjoyed, and please be sure to subscribe, as it helps me out considerably in terms of growth on this platform. I'm signing off.